5 months earlier, he had been the first man in the world to fly it. He had taken the largest bomber ever built up off a runway outside Seattle on a grey morning in September of 1942. He circled the city for an hour. He brought it back down, soft as an airliner. And then he said 2 words. She flies. That was all. He was the best test pilot in America, and he almost never offered an opinion on an airplane. He had flown hundreds of them. For this one, he made an exception. 2 words and a grunt, and he climbed down. Now it is the 18th of February 1943. He's back in the same machine, a few thousand feet over the city, and it is on fire. The fire is in the engines. He can see the field. He turns the enormous airplane toward home, and he flies it the way only he can fly it. And for a moment, it looks like he is going to make it. He gets within a mile of the runway. A mile short, the bomber falls out of control and goes down into a meatpacking plant on the south edge of Seattle. By the time the fire burns out, more than 30 people are dead, in the air and on the ground. Here is what the man at the controls never learns, because he is already gone. He was right. She flies. And the machine that is killing him at this moment will become the most important airplane of the entire war. Both of those things are true, and that is the part that should not make sense. The airplane that cannot stop killing the men who believe in it is the same airplane the whole war will end up depending on. He doesn't know that. He knows only the fire and the field a mile away, and that he is not going to reach it. The pilot's name was Edmund Allen. Everyone called him Eddie. He was Boeing's chief test pilot, the man the company trusted with every airplane it had ever built. And here is the cruelty of it. Allen had not been handed this machine and ordered to risk his neck on it. He had vouched for it. You already heard his verdict from that first flight, the 2 words he almost never gave any airplane. She flies, and he was not alone. One of Boeing's best aerodynamicists, a man named George Scherer, came down from an early flight and said it was the first airplane that let him go home after the first flight, with, in his words, damn little left to do. The Army officer who ran the entire project flew it himself the day after Allen did and scribbled his notes in something close to disbelief. Unbelievable, he wrote, for such a large airplane to be so easy on the controls. Easier to fly than a B-17. Faster than any heavy bomber before it. Once, Allen and that same officer took it up with a full load and simply forgot to set the flaps for takeoff, and the overloaded airplane lifted itself off the runway and flew anyway. The men who knew airplanes better than anyone alive had looked at this one and let down their guard. And then it killed him. The official report into his death could not even say for certain what had done it. Fire had broken out in the engines, and the investigation board wrote a single word for the cause: indefinite. What the report did was simple. It grounded the entire program. The airplane Eddie Allen died in did not fly again for 7 months. They tore into it looking for every place a fire could start, and they did not let it leave the ground again until September. And then they kept building it anyway. You have to stop on that, because it is the whole story in one sentence. The best pilot in the country had just been killed by this machine. The men who built it could not say why. They grounded it. They admitted in writing that they did not fully understand it. And then they poured more money and more men into it than into almost any other project of the war. They did it for one reason: the enemy. By 1943, the war America most wanted to fight was a war it could not actually reach. Germany was a problem you could fly to from England. Japan was not. Japan sat behind thousands of miles of open ocean, and there was no airfield in friendly hands close enough to do anything about it. The nearest usable bases were in the middle of China, and even from there it was about 1,600 miles to the Japanese home islands. One way. The bombers America already had could not make that trip. A B-17 or a B-24 loaded with enough bombs to matter had a useful reach of maybe 1,000 miles before it had to turn around. 1,600 miles out and 1,600 back with bombs in between was simply not a thing those airplanes could do. The most determined enemy the United States faced was, for all practical purposes, untouchable. You could win every island in the Pacific and still not be able to put a single bomb on the factories that were arming the men defending them. This airplane was the answer to that exact problem, and the numbers are why the country forgave it everything. It was designed to carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, more than 1,500 miles from its base, and bring its crew home. It cruised above 30,000 feet, higher than most of the fighters that would be sent up to stop it. It was the first bomber in the world built with a pressurized cabin, so the men inside could function at that altitude without freezing in thin air. On paper, it was the only machine on Earth that could take the war to Japan itself. And it was enormous, a third again the size of the B-17 that came before it. More than 11 miles of wiring ran through its frame, 150 separate electric motors of nearly 50 different types. Structural beams built like the trusswork of a bridge. It was less an airplane than a flying building, and it was the most complicated machine most of the men who would fly it had ever been asked to trust with their lives. So the country bet everything on it. By most accounts, the program cost more than $3 billion, more than the United States spent to build the atomic bomb. Think about that order of operations for a moment. Before there was a finished bomb to drop, America had already spent more building the airplane to carry it than it would spend on the weapon itself. The decision was made coldly and deliberately to accept a bomber nobody trusted, with engines nobody could fully explain, because the alternative was leaving the enemy beyond reach. The engines were the heart of the problem. Each one was a Wright R335. A huge, powerful engine forced into a tight cowling that could not shed heat fast enough. The cylinders at the back ran hot. Too hot. Under the wrong conditions, on a long climb at full power with a heavy load, an engine could overheat and catch fire in the air. And once a fire took hold behind that much fuel and that much metal, it did not always agree to go out. There were 4 of those engines on every airplane. The machine that killed Eddie Allen was not a bad prototype that got fixed. It was the design. Every B-29 that ever rolled off a production line carried 4 of the same engines that had just killed the best pilot in America. And the men who would fly them were about to find that out the hard way, thousands of them, long before they ever saw an enemy. The pressure to get the airplane to war came from the very top, and it came with a date attached. The president wanted bombs falling on Japan, and he wanted it soon. The head of the Army Air Forces, General Hap Arnold, had stood up in front of the Allied leadership and promised that these new bombers would be in the fight by the start of 1944. It was a promise made about an airplane that was still trying to kill its own test pilots. But the promise was made, and now it had to be kept, and the schedule did not care that the machine was not ready. So Arnold made a decision that would define the next 6 months. He would not wait for the factories to deliver finished airplanes. He would take them as they came, half-corrected, and have the rest of the work done after they left the line. The bombers would be fixed in the field. That decision had an address: Kansas, the great flat center of the country where the modification field sat out in the open and where the winter of 1943 into 1944 was waiting. In March of 1944, Arnold himself came out to Kansas to watch his bombers leave for the war. He arrived expecting to see a line of finished Superfortresses ready to fly to Asia. He found none. Not one of them was fit to go. The airplanes were sitting on the ramps, unfinished, hundreds of corrections still owed on each one, and the deadline he had personally promised was already on top of him. What his anger set off is remembered now as the Battle of Kansas. It was not a battle against any enemy. It was a battle against the machine and against the cold and against the clock. The army poured people into those fields. Mechanics, engineers, depot crews, civilian workers, brought in and turned loose on the bombers around the clock. And the work could not wait for shelter, because there was not enough shelter, so most of it happened outside. On the open ramps, in a Kansas winter, the temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there. On the worst nights, they fell below 0, and the wind came across that flat country with nothing to stop it. So the real feel of the cold was something worse again. Men worked under floodlights on metal that pulled the warmth out of bare hands. They ran the engines up in blowing snow to chase down the faults. They climbed onto the wings in the dark, in storms, to reach fittings that no engineer had ever imagined a man trying to reach outdoors in January. A single bomber could swallow thousands of hours of hand labor before it was fit to fly, and there were not thousands of hours left. There were days, and it worked, in the brutal way these things work. The first 11 bombers were dragged up to a standard and pushed out the door by the end of March, just barely, and sent on their way to India and to the long fight ahead. More followed behind them. The deadline was met, more or less. The airplanes went to war. But be honest about what that effort actually was, because it tells you what kind of weapon this was from the very start. This was not a machine that arrived finished and proved itself. This was a machine that the country forced into existence with frozen hands, in the open, at a cost in labor and money and sheer stubbornness that almost no other program could have survived. The men in those fields did not get a photograph or a medal. They got the cold and the deadline and a bomber that still was not safe when they were done. Because here is the thing, none of that winter labor could fix. You could splice the wiring on the ramp. You could correct the fittings by hand. You could not change the fact that the engines still ran too hot. The fires did not stop in Kansas. The corrections made the airplane fly. They did not make it safe. The fires simply traveled with it. They followed the bomber to the training fields and to the long overwater flights and across the Pacific, everywhere the airplane went. They followed it, in fact, to places where there was no enemy at all, where the only thing that could kill you was the machine you were sitting in. On the 30th of December, 1944, a B-29 took off from Walker Army Airfield in Kansas on a training flight. There was no enemy within 4,000 miles. There were 13 men aboard. At 25,000 feet, the number 3 engine caught fire. The crew did what they were trained to do. By the book, they had perhaps 2 minutes to deal with it. They did not get 2 minutes. The fire ran into the wing, and the wing did not simply fail. It exploded, and the blast tore the entire right wing off the airplane. A bomber without a wing does not glide. It falls. 4 men got out of it. One of them was a flight engineer named Vern Roycraft, an instructor riding along on a routine flight on a cold day 3 days before the new year. He went out of a disintegrating airplane into open air at altitude, into a sky that was around 30 degrees below zero. And here a small, ordinary thing becomes the whole horror of it. The airplane had been warm inside. The men had taken off their heavy winter gear because they did not need it in a heated cabin. So, they fell into killing cold with almost nothing on. Roycraft fell on purpose. He fell for 2 miles, 10,000 feet of free fall before he pulled the cord, because opening a parachute too high in that cold and that wind was its own way to die slowly. Near him, one of the other men who got out pulled his ripcord too soon. His parachute opened into the fire still streaming off the wreck, and it caught. He came down beside Roycraft, and he was already dead when he landed. 10 of the 13 men on that airplane were killed. The bomber came down on a farm in Ellis County, Kansas, 13 miles from the runway it had left a few minutes earlier. We know their names. The pilot was a first lieutenant named Rufus Anderson. There was a bombardier instructor, a captain named Lloyd Coffey, who had climbed aboard to teach. There was a navigator, a radio operator, gunners, and a student engineer who had gotten on that airplane to learn how it worked and never got off. 10 men on a training flight over their own country, killed by their own machine on the next to last day of the year. And this was not a freak. This is the part of the story that never made it into the famous photographs, so let one number carry it. By the end of the war, the Army had lost 414 of these bombers. Of those, only 147 were brought down by the enemy. Do that subtraction. More than 260 B-29s were destroyed by something other than Japan. By accidents, by failures. Most of all, by their own engines catching fire. Read it the plain way. This airplane killed far more of its own than the enemy ever did. The men over Kansas, the crews who went down on training flights and ferry flights and long empty stretches of ocean, the ones who never saw a Japanese fighter in their lives, outnumbered the ones the enemy actually shot down, almost 2-1. The most dangerous thing about flying a B-29 for a very long time was the B-29. That is the machine. Hold on to it, because in a moment the Army is going to take this exact airplane, this beautiful, lethal, half-understood machine that burns its own crews on quiet training fields, and it is going to choose it for the single most important mission of the entire war. Not in spite of what it was, because of what it was. Because nothing else in the world could do what it did. The men who made that choice had read the accident reports. They knew the number. They signed off anyway because there was no other airplane that could do what was about to be asked, and the war would not wait for a safer one. In December of 1943, while the modification fields in Kansas were still fighting the cold, a separate and far stranger order went out, very quietly, to the engineering command at Wright Field in Ohio. Take one B-29, take it apart, and rebuild it to carry a single bomb that did not yet exist. The program was given a code name chosen precisely because it meant nothing: Silverplate. There was no clue in the word, nothing to decode, and that was the point. For the rest of the war, that one meaningless word written on a request for parts or men or priority would quietly move things to the front of any line in the country, and almost no one who saw it had any idea why. What they did to the airplane tells you everything about the weapon they were preparing for, long before anyone involved was allowed to say the word atomic out loud. First, they stripped it. They pulled out the armor plate that protected the crew. They took off the gun turrets, the remote-controlled guns that were the bomber's entire defense, and left only the two guns in the tail. The Army's own proud account of this bomber had boasted of guns that covered it from every angle, power-driven, and a crew tucked safe behind heavy armor plate. Silverplate tore all of that back out. Think about what that means. They were building an airplane to fly into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, and they deliberately stripped away its ability to defend itself. That sounds insane until you understand the trade. Every gun, every turret, every plate of armor was weight. And this airplane was going to have to do something no bomber had ever done. It would carry one enormous, almost unbelievably heavy object a very long way, drop it, and then get as far from that object as physically possible before it went off. No gun could save the crew from what they were carrying. Only height and speed and distance could, so they threw away the guns and bought lightness instead. Stripped down, the Silverplate airplane weighed around 7,000 pounds less than a standard B-29. Then they rebuilt what was left, and every change was an argument about survival. They put in the new fuel-injected version of the R3350. It was, at last, a partial answer to the fires. The same fires that had killed Eddie Allen. The same fires still falling out of the sky over Kansas that winter with crews aboard. 2 years and hundreds of men too late. The engine was finally a little less likely to burn the people inside it. They fitted propellers that could reverse their own pitch, so the airplane could stop in a shorter distance on the small island runways it would have to use. They replaced the bomb bay doors with new ones driven by compressed air, so they could snap open and shut in a fraction of the old time, because over the target, every second the airplane spent exposed was a second too many. Inside, they rebuilt the bomb bay itself around a single object far larger than anything a bomber was made to hold. And because no American hardware existed to carry one weapon of that size and release it cleanly, they reached across the ocean and borrowed a British design, a single heavy hook, the kind the RAF had built to drop its own giant bombs. They added a new crew position too, a station for a new kind of crewman called a weaponeer, an officer whose entire job would be the bomb itself. Now, add it all up, and you can read the weapon in the shape of the airplane, the way you can read a hand from the glove. Something enormous. Something so heavy that grown men agreed to give up their guns to carry it. Something so dangerous that the entire machine had been redesigned into one long answer to a single question, which was how to be somewhere very far away at the instant the thing worked. The first rebuilt airplane was finished in February of 1944, and they took it out to the desert, to Muroc in California, to find out whether it would even drop properly. It is worth naming who was in that airplane, because they were not famous men, and the records that hold their names are thin, but they were there first. The pilot was a lieutenant named Shields. The flight engineer was a sergeant named Rochlitz. 7 or 8 men in a stripped-down secret bomber over the California desert, releasing heavy concrete shapes built to fall exactly the way the real thing would fall, watching them drop, measuring how the airplane behaved when something that size left the bay. They were testing the ballistics of a weapon that, as far as they knew, was just an oddly shaped block of concrete. And that was the rule, top to bottom. You knew your own job and nothing past it. The men flying the test drops did not know what the real bomb would be. The mechanics keeping the airplanes alive did not know. The whole apparatus of secrecy was built so that the weapon could be assembled out of thousands of people who each held one small piece of it and never once saw the shape of the whole. A man could spend the entire war inside this program and go home believing he had been working on some kind of very large ordinary bomb. In the end, the Army would build only 65 of these stripped, secret airplanes. A tiny hidden fleet lost inside the tens of thousands of ordinary bombers pouring out of American factories. Most of them would never carry anything but practice loads, and only about 15 would ever be handed to the men who would fly the real thing. Those men were already gathering at a brand new unit activated at the very end of 1944 at a field most people had never heard of and were never meant to. The place was called Wendover, out on the salt flats where Utah runs into Nevada. It was chosen for exactly one quality. There was nothing there. Nothing for miles in any direction, no town worth the name, no reason for anyone to come, and no easy way to see in. You could train a secret there and the desert would keep it. The unit was the 509th Composite Group, brought into being in December of 1944. And it was the first group in the history of the Army Air Forces built for one purpose only, to deliver an atomic bomb. Its heart was a single bomb squadron, the 393rd flying the stripped-down Silverplate machines, and around it the Army wrapped everything that one squadron would need to function as a world unto itself. Its own transport, its own engineers, its own supply, so that it would never have to depend on or explain itself to anyone outside. The man given the unit was a hard, exacting pilot named Paul Tibbets. He had been picked in September of 1944, an officer with a serious combat record over Europe, and the job he was handed was almost impossible on its face. Build a unit, train it to perfection. Around an airplane that barely existed yet, to drop a weapon you are not permitted to describe, for a mission you cannot fully explain even to the men you are training. He was told only that it might shorten the war. He pulled men he trusted from his old command to fill the key seats, and he ran the place with a discipline that the men remembered for the rest of their lives, and he told them almost nothing, because almost nothing was all he was allowed to tell. So they trained in the dark, in every sense. The crews flew long high-altitude missions and practiced the strange, violent escape turn they would need after release, the maneuver that would buy them their distance. They dropped practice shapes, and in time those shapes became real, full-size casings filled with ordinary high explosive, built to match the exact weight and fall of the secret weapon. The men called them pumpkins for the round, fat shape of them, and they dropped them over and over without being told what they were rehearsing for. Most of the group believed they were preparing to deliver some kind of unusually large conventional bomb. A few thought it might be a new chemical or incendiary weapon. They were wrong, every one of them, and they would stay wrong until the world found out all at once. The secrecy was not a mood, it was the architecture of the entire thing. When the unit finally flew its mission, the men who actually understood the weapon were so deliberately walled off from the rest that it showed even in the paint. On the most famous of these airplanes, 12 men flew the mission, but only 9 names were ever painted on the fuselage. The 3 left off were the bomb specialists, the weaponeer and his assistant, and the officer watching the enemy's radar, the men whose job was the device itself. They were not crew in the ordinary sense. They were the keepers of the secret, and the secret did not get its name on the airplane. That weaponeer was a naval officer named William Parsons, who everyone called Deak, And his job is the detail that tells you how frightened the people running this were of their own weapon. They did not trust the bomb to survive a takeoff. They had watched for 2 years these airplanes burn and crash on runways for no enemy reason at all, and they knew that if one went down on takeoff with a live atomic weapon aboard, the result did not bear thinking about. So they decided the bomb would leave the ground unfinished. And once the airplane was safely up and away, Parsons would climb down into the bay in flight and arm the weapon by hand. The most powerful bomb ever built would be made ready in the air by one man on his knees in a freezing bomb bay, specifically because no one trusted the airplane underneath him to take off without trying to kill everyone on board. Every piece of it, the empty desert, the silence, the men who never knew, the bomb armed in mid-air, all of it traced back to the same 2 facts that had run through the whole story from the beginning. This was the only airplane that could reach the enemy. And this was an airplane that could not entirely be trusted to keep its own crew alive. The 509th lived in the space between those 2 truths, and so, in the end, did the weapon. By now, the secret was nearly perfect. The airplane, the unit, the man who would arm the bomb in mid-air. All of it poised out on the salt flats, waiting. And every bit of it rested on a single assumption that had very nearly collapsed before any of it mattered. That this airplane could reach Japan at all. Before the secret could ever be used, the bomber had to do the plain, brutal thing it was built for. And the first time America tried, it almost broke on the attempt. They tried it from China. The plan had a name, Operation Matterhorn, and on paper it was elegant. Base the bombers in India, stage them forward through fields in China, and from there strike the Japanese home islands. In June of 1944, it happened. B-29s lifted off, crossed into Japanese skies, and put their bombs on a great steel works at Yawata. After 2.5 years, the home islands of the untouchable enemy had finally been bombed. The airplane had done the impossible thing. And then the impossible thing turned out to be impossible to keep doing. The problem was not the enemy. It was the map. The China bases had no supply line except the air itself. Every drop of fuel, every bomb, every spare part for those bombers had to be flown in over the Himalayas. Over the mountain route the crews called the Hump, one of the most dangerous stretches of sky in the world. And the arithmetic of it was crushing. To put enough fuel in place at the forward fields for a single bombing run against Japan took something like 12 flights over those mountains first. The airplane could reach the enemy. It simply could not reach him often enough or in enough strength to change anything. The effort chewed through fuel, through aircraft, through the men who flew the Hump, and even through its own commanders, and for all of it, the bombs that actually fell on Japan were a trickle. The answer, in the end, was not a better airplane. The airplane was already capable. The answer was a better address. It came at hideous cost, paid by other men in another fight entirely. In the middle of 1944, American forces took the Mariana Islands, Saipan, and Tinian and Guam, fighting for them island by island. And those islands changed everything, because they could be supplied by sea. No more Hump. No more dozen flights to buy one. A ship could pull into the harbor and fill the tanks. And from Tinian, it was about 1,500 miles to Tokyo, the exact distance this bomber had been built to fly. The first Superfortresses came down onto the new island runways in October of 1944. By late November, they were over Tokyo itself. Now, at last, the machine was the thing it had been promised to be at the very beginning. Back when its best pilot died proving it could fly. It could reach the enemy, and it could keep reaching him, again and again, from islands the enemy could not take back. Everything the airplane had cost, the money, the winters, the burned crews, all of it had been a bet that this moment would come, and it had, which is exactly the moment the secret was waiting for. And so, in early August of 1945, the stripped-down secret bombers flew from Tinian to Japan. Each one carried a single weapon in a bomb bay rebuilt to hold it. Each one used the height and the speed and the hard-won lightness it had been designed around to do the one thing it was for, which was to be far away when the weapon worked. and the war ended. The most destructive war in human history stopped within days after an airplane the United States had never fully trusted carried a weapon almost no one had been allowed to see, to a place that nothing else on Earth could have reached. It is easy from where we stand to see only that ending. The famous airplane, the famous mission, the one photograph everyone has seen. But go back to the grey morning over Seattle, 3 years before any of it. Go back to the best test pilot in America, climbing down off the largest bomber ever built, saying his 2 words and meaning them. She flies. He was right, and he never knew how right. He paid for those 2 words with his life 5 months later, and he was only the first of a very long line. The men frozen to the metal in the Kansas dark. The 10 who fell out of the sky over Ellis County 3 days before the new year, in their shirt sleeves, because the airplane had been warm. The hundreds of crews who went down to their own engines without ever seeing the enemy. The men of the 509th who trained for a year to deliver a weapon no one would name for them. The machine killed its makers and its crews on its own side of the ocean for 2 solid years. And then it reached the enemy, and the war was over. Both of those things are true. They were always, every day, the same airplane. The strange part is how much of this the people who lived it wrote down. The officer who ran the entire project for the army wrote the airplane's story up for a magazine in the summer of 1944, glowing with pride, at the very moment the machine was still burning its own crews over Kansas and the long Pacific. And even in that proud account, in his own hand sits one flat little sentence about Eddie Allen. The causes were indefinite. We read it. The man who fell 10,000 feet over Kansas told his own story, in his own words, to a small-town newspaper a few months later, and that is the only reason we can tell it to you now. These men left a record. Almost nobody ever goes back and reads it. So, if you do nothing else, remember the first one, not the airplane, the man who flew it before anyone else in the world, and trusted it and was right, Eddie Allen. If you think a name like that deserves to be said out loud once in a while, instead of vanishing into a footnote under a famous photograph, just leave it here, so we know you came and you listened. These men are easier to keep than you would think. It only takes someone deciding not to forget.